featured peer talk presenter tonight, who will speak to our membership about his recovery from schizophrenia and about his inspiring story of surviving serious mental illness and thriving through personal resiliency and overcoming personal adversity. Darrell is the author of Straight Talk About Living with Serious Mental Illness, which was published in 2019. And this speaks to his direct experience of recovery and hope for the recovery of others with histories of serious mental illness. As a licensed mental health professional and the NSSC education coordinator, I personally endorse this very compact publication as the best single guide to living with mental illness that I've ever read, and which I highly recommend to all, particularly those in our organization. We will add it to the Policy Action Google Groups site as a required reading for our membership. That's okay with you, Darrell. A little by way of introduction about Darrell's background. Darrell experienced his first psychotic episode as a U.S. Army field artillery gunnery and nuclear weapons specialist, during which he suffered a paranoid delusional episode. This, by the way, is the military area of expertise of Dr. John Liebert, who spoke to us in February on identifying high risk for violence in individuals with psychosis who present to licensed medical professionals, particularly in the emergency departments of general hospitals and other health settings. So after Darrell retired from the Army, he had a very successful career as a computer programmer for many years before having recurrent psychotic episodes and decided to go on disability in 2004. After going on disability, Darrell participated in schizophrenia support groups and approached Mental Health America about leading groups as a peer support counselor. By his estimate, Darrell has had contacts with over many years of his experience with over 30,000 individuals in the peer groups that he leads. He is the recipient of the Jefferson Award and has appeared as a peer advocate in the Ohio news media. During these groups, Darrell met his future wife, who had a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder at the time. They had been married for 13 years. They are examples we know of hope in surviving serious mental illness, thriving in their lives that are successful, productive, and meaningful. Darrell and his are, by the way, jazz enthusiasts and may be found frequently in attendance at local Ohio music concerts and festivals. A note on our process for tonight: we will allow 30 to 45 minutes for Darrell's presentation, followed by a question and answer period. Please use the reactions icon where you will see a step down icon for raised hands. We will recognize you by raising your hand in that reactions icon, and questions will be taken in order by Ann Corcoran in the chat box. So please, if we don't get to your question tonight, Darrell has indicated that he would be delighted to personally respond to the questions that if we run out of time, we're not able to get to. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Darrell Herrmann. Darrell?
Thank you, Dr. Creekmore. I'd like to start tonight by talking a little bit about physical illness for a moment, which may seem strange, but most of us have experience with physical illness before we get in touch with the mental illness community. Now, for physical illnesses, we have lots of diagnostic tests. If we measure your blood pressure to 180 over 120, you've got high blood pressure, something we can measure. If your blood sugar is 400, you've got diabetes. Again, something we can measure. We have x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs and blood tests of all kinds, all sorts of diagnostic tests to tell us what the problem is. But once we know what the problem is, we usually know what the treatment is as well. For example, if you have an infection, the doctor determines it's a bacteria. He can culture the bacteria, find out what antibiotic will best kill the bacteria, and then prescribe that antibiotic to get you well. This is how normal physical medicine works. When you come to mental illness, all that goes out the window. First off, we have no diagnostic test whatsoever to determine if you have schizophrenia, schizoaffective, or bipolar disorder. No diagnostic test of any kind. The way that we also have no idea what the cause of these illnesses are. There have been literally dozens of genes involved and hundreds of environmental factors, but we have no idea what the exact cause of any of these mental illnesses is. We also, as I said, have no diagnostic test, so the diagnosis is very subjective. All the doctor does is makes a list of what symptoms he thinks you have. Then he goes to the DSM-5 or Diagnostic Systematic Mental Disorders version 5 and looks up those symptoms. All this book is a list of what symptoms go with what mental illness. The doctor tries to find the best match he can, and that becomes your diagnosis. Different doctors may have different opinions. Sometimes symptoms change over the course of time. Sometimes the book itself changes. All these things can lead to changes in diagnosis. So it's important to realize that a diagnosis doesn't really do a whole lot for you. It's nice to have a label and say, I have such and such a diagnosis, but what's really important is whether or not your treatment works and you're getting better. And the reason that's important is because we don't treat based on the diagnosis. We treat based on what symptoms you're exhibiting. We prescribe medications for psychosis. We prescribe medications for mania. We prescribe medications for depression. We do not prescribe medications based on what your diagnosis is. We treat based on what the symptoms are. And it's important to remember that the medications are all trial and error. We don't have any idea what any given medication is going to do for you until you take it. We just have to try and experiment and find out what works for you. We also have side effects of these medications. It's important to remember that all medications have side effects. Even such common medications as aspirin and Tylenol have side effects. But the side effects of our psychiatric medications aren't as easy to deal with as those of aspirin and Tylenol. But it's important to remember that we're looking for relief from our psychiatric symptoms. In order to get that relief, we may have to live with some side effects. And unfortunately, for some of us, we would have to live with some symptoms in addition to the side effects. For example, I still hear voices occasionally, even though I take my medications as prescribed. Something else that's important to realize about diagnoses is that we often talk today about a spectrum. We talk about schizophrenia spectrum or psychotic spectrum. When I first got involved, we talked about it as a continuum, where schizophrenia was a one end of the continuum, bipolar disorder was the other, schizoaffective somewhere in the middle. And it was common to accept that you could move within that continuum over the course of your lifetime. Since the word spectrum has come into common use, I don't hear very many people talking about moving in the spectrum like they used to talk about moving the continuum. And that's very important because your diagnosis can change over the course of time. For example, about 15 years ago, I came across a very interesting interview of a British schizophrenia researcher who's very famous, very well known, called Dr. Robin Murray. And in this interview, he was talking about what particular episode he'd experienced where he was prepared to do a schizophrenia study, and his researchers were interviewing patients trying to decide what their diagnosis was to make sure they had schizophrenia for the study. One of his researchers came up to him one day and said, Dr. Murray, this patient was previously in one of our studies with schizophrenia, but he clearly has bipolar disorder. Dr. Murray said, that's interesting. Let me see the write-up. Dr. Murray looked the write-up and said, you're correct. He clearly has bipolar disorder, not schizophrenia. Who diagnosed him with schizophrenia incorrectly years ago? Dr. Murray flipped back through the chart, and it turned out that Dr. Murray himself was the one who had diagnosed the patient with schizophrenia a couple of years ago. This is a case where both diagnoses were correct. They were both agreed to by the same doctor. Over the course of time, the patient changed diagnoses from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder. And that's a very real possibility. Diagnoses sometimes change. And that's why it's important to learn as much as you can about whatever diagnosis you currently have, whether it's schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar, cancer, diabetes, or heart disease. The more you know about whatever diagnosis you have, the better off you are. Work with your treatment team, cooperate with your treatment, know what your treatment should be. Knowledge is power. The more you know about whatever diagnosis you have, the better off you are. Now, I'm talking tonight about psychosis, psychotic illness. Let's define what psychosis is for a moment. Psychosis simply means that you are having hallucinations and delusions, and that because those hallucinations and delusions are your reality, you act in ways that make no sense to those around you. Remember, the hallucinations and delusions are real to the person experiencing them. That's why he acts in ways that make no sense to those around him. That's very simple, very straightforward. Now, hallucinations are sensory experiences that we have that those around us don't. For schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, we typically talk about hearing voices that aren't there. It's important to realize there's more than just voices. It's really art hallucinations as well as voices. It can be any sound you can imagine hearing, any sound at all. Some people may hear doors slamming, bells ringing, telephones, even music. It can be any sound at all. That affects a lot of people. It's the most common psychotic symptom, but you could also have hallucinations of any of the other senses as well. Hallucinations can affect hearing, sight, smell, taste, or touch. It can affect any of the five senses. But while the person is experiencing hallucination, it's usually very real to them. It's often very hard to tell the difference between hallucination and reality. And that's part of psychosis. To us, when we're psychotic, the hallucinations are real. Now let's talk about delusions for a moment. Delusions are fixed, false beliefs that a person has regardless of evidence to the contrary. It could be grandiose natures. First, I think it's Jesus Christ, or the Pope, or the President of the United States, or the Antichrist. It could be anything along those lines. And delusions often are religious. So delusions can be anything. They can also be paranoid. You can believe the CIA or the FBI is after you, that your phone is bugged, that there are cameras on the walls watching you. And it can be anything you can imagine, anything at all. And again, to the person experiencing it while he's psychotic, that is as real as anything you've ever experienced. It seems absolutely, totally, factually real and true to you. That's why psychosis is so dangerous. And that's why it's so hard to figure out what's going on, because of the person, the hallucinations, delusions are real. Now let's talk about something else that often comes along with psychosis. This is a condition called anosognosia. That simply means that the person is unable to recognize that he's ill and has a problem distinguishing what reality is. This can take many forms. It's a physical problem. It's not being in denial. The person can't recognize they have a problem. It's not accepting a problem. They can't recognize it. And I'll give you a case example of this. About 10 years ago, I was talking to a police officer at a Columbus CIT program, and he told me a story about a young man he'd experienced with that had psychotic illness. He first observed this man while he was doing his beat, and he saw the man standing on a street corner begging. He was notable because he was missing one leg and using crutches to get around. Well, the officer eventually struck up a conversation with the young man. The young man told him that he was an Iraq war veteran, that he lost his leg in Iraq. The officer decided to be a good Samaritan, so he offered to take the young man to the VA clinic here in Columbus and get him a prosthetic leg. That sounded like a good idea to the young man, so he said, I'll do that. So the officer picked him up, took him to the VA clinic, only to find out that the people at the VA clinic knew the young man very well. He'd been brought there many times before by would-be good Samaritans. It turns out that the young man was never a veteran. He'd never been in Iraq. He had in fact lost his leg due to amputation as a result of having gangrene caused by using a dirty needle to inject illicit drugs. That was why he lost his leg. Well, the officer was kind of surprised about all this, but after that, the officer said he still saw the young man on the street corner, still begging, still using crutches, and still saying he was an Iraq war veteran who had lost his leg in Iraq. To that person, that was real. That was his reality. Even though he was no longer psychotic, the persistent false memories he had of being in Iraq and losing his leg there were as real to him as anything else you may have experienced yourself. And that's an example of anosognosia. It can take many forms, but that's one example. And that's a persistent false memory. And also, I have to admit that for myself, there are things that happened to me over 40 years ago when I first experienced psychosis myself, that to this day, I am not sure what was real and what was hallucination illusions. Because when you're experiencing it, it is real to you, as real as anything you've ever experienced yourself. And it's hard to distinguish what isn't really real after the fact, because it seems absolutely real. And we have a problem with our mental health community in that a lot of people that are considered mental health professionals, a lot of people that call themselves mental health advocates, do not understand what I just told you about psychosis. They have false ideas of what it is. They don't understand what it is. They don't understand what it does. They think the people are just acting willfully and can change their behavior they want to. And the best example I can give you of how true this is something called mental health first aid. Now, if you're not familiar with it, mental health first aid is a course that claims to teach you how to cope with mental illness, how to help people in crisis, how to get them help, how to deal with them, and also educate you about mental illness. Now, I've never taken the course myself, but I have read their textbook. And from what I know, most of the textbook appears to make sense and have good information. But I'm not qualified to comment on that because that's not my area of expertise. I can, however, comment on the section on psychosis and psychotic illnesses. And to be honest, it's pure garbage. They try to explain what psychosis is without using the words hallucination delusions at all. And that's all psychosis is, having hallucination delusions. The only mention of hallucination delusions in that part of the book is under schizophrenia. They don't do a very good job of explaining hallucination delusions and what schizophrenia is either, but at least they mention hallucination delusions under schizophrenia. They do not mention that many people with bipolar disorder also become psychotic. They do not mention that some people with depression become psychotic. There's no mention that psychosis can have many causes and is part of many diagnoses. Very confusing, very disorganized, very incorrect information. It's totally garbage. I think you could probably consider it disinformation as opposed to good information. Now, mental health first aid, as I said, is a very widely touted and very widespread course. It's taught by many government agencies throughout the country. It's primarily promoted by both NAMI and Mental Health America. They actively endorse it. And there's many other professional agencies and people that do promote and endorse this program. It is in fact international in scope. It started in Australia. There are currently 29 countries teaching mental health first aid. It's also considered evidence-based. And people that are part of the mental health community may not realize this, but to the mental health community, evidence-based is the gold standard for what's good information, what you should trust, what you should believe. And this is a case where being evidence-based is putting out garbage about psychosis. I don't know what that says about evidence-based, but it clearly shows that even if you're looking with something that's evidence-based, you need to do your due diligence to make sure what is putting out is actually correct and truthful. Now I'd like to go on to something else. Let's talk about stigma for a moment. We often talk about stigma with mental illness. Stigma is basically just prejudice and discrimination by another name. The most common cause of stigma is lack of information, lack of knowledge about mental illness. People don't understand it. They don't know what it is. They have strange ideas they've heard. So they are against people with mental illness. And these are usually based on stereotypes. These stereotypes are just as prevalent and just as incorrect, just as wrong to believe as the very common stereotypes about race and cultural background that are loudly denounced by everyone today. Some of the examples of this, there's a myth that all people with psychotic illnesses are violent. That's not true. There are a very small number that are violent, but there are a very small number. And most people with psychotic illnesses are more likely to be victims of violence than to actually commit it. There's also a stereotype that people with mental illness, particularly psychosis, have impaired thinking and intelligence. Again, this is totally false. You're still a person. You still have the same abilities and backgrounds you had before you became psychotic. It doesn't change you as a person. And people are what they are, regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis. Mental health professionals often tell you to look at the person, not the diagnosis. And that's true. Each of us has our own special abilities, our own special limitations, and that doesn't necessarily apply to the mental illness that's causing that. Another thing you need to look at is that a lot of people have an expectation that we cannot live on our own, be employed, or financially self-supporting. And there's a very small number that's true of, but many people do well. There are people that have very good jobs, responsible jobs, demanding jobs. It's just like everything else. There are abilities and limitations each of us have. Some of us can do very well, and a very small number of us do very poorly and can't support ourselves. But again, you have to look at the individual, not the diagnosis. And that's some of the common things about stigma. There's something else I want to talk about too here very quickly. there's something called self-stigma. This is where the person with the illness also buys into the stigma that everybody else has about it. And this shouldn't be surprising because we're creatures of our background. We all grow up with the same culture, the same ideas, the same background. So most of those patients buy into the same stigmas, the same myths and misconceptions about mental illness that everybody else has. So they have the idea that if they become diagnosed with a psychotic illness, their life is over. They have nothing to look forward to, their life is over. And that's definitely not true. And I'm living proof of that. I went to work as a computer programmer for 18 years after being diagnosed with schizophrenia and completed my BS in computer science after being diagnosed with schizophrenia before I became a computer programmer. Everyone has a chance to do what they can do. Each of us has our own abilities and limitations. Regardless of what our mental illness is, again, you look at the person, not the mental illness. Now, I think the biggest source of stigma in our communities today is, in fact, the mental health profession, which keeps telling us to fight stigma. From my observations, many mental health professionals believe the above stereotypes about psychotic illnesses. For example, at one point, I had a psychiatrist who changed my diagnosis from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder simply because he did not believe that a schizophrenia could work successfully as a computer programmer. I lived with the diagnosis of bipolar disorder for a short while. He realized that didn't fit, so he changed to schizoaffective disorder, and I had that diagnosis for about 6 years. He also put me on mood stabilizers, which I never needed, never should have been taking. And it took about 6 years before I got a new doctor that did a very thorough intake interview and said, I don't see any signs that you've ever been manic. If you've never been manic, you can't have bipolar, you don't have schizoaffective disorder, you actually have schizophrenia, just like the Army diagnosed you many years ago. And he took me off all the mood stabilizers. That was in 1997. Since 1997, I've taken no mood stabilizers. The only thing I've taken is my antipsychotic. I think that's a good indication that schizophrenia was, in fact, the correct diagnosis, not bipolar. But that one psychiatrist changed my diagnosis simply because he did not believe a schizophrenia could work successfully as a computer programmer. And some of the other things about mental health professionals, some will not tell you your diagnosis. There are psychiatrists and mental health professionals out there that believe schizophrenia or schizoaffective or bipolar is too serious a diagnosis to tell someone they have. So in this case, what happens is a lot of patients end up with a bottle of pills or a prescription for a bottle of pills, and they're supposed to come back in 30 days and nothing else. That's all they get. They don't know the diagnosis. They don't know what they're being treated for. They don't know what the side effects of medication are. All they've got is a prescription for a bottle of pills and an appointment to come back in 30 days. Now, unfortunately, that's happening a lot today, to this day. Most mental health professionals also do no education about how to live and cope with a mental illness. They seem to think that the only thing you need is medication. And if you take your medication, everything else will just simply work itself out. But that's not true. There's a lot that goes into recovery besides medication. The medication is the essential first step, yes, but there's much more you need besides medication to be in recovery. The common situation today is kind of like diagnosing someone with type 1 diabetes and then tell them to take insulin and send them on their way with no further education whatsoever. That's essentially what we're doing with our people with psychotic illnesses today. We're diagnosing them, tell them to take meds, and go on their way. We give them no other education whatsoever in most cases. Now, there are a few mental health professionals who do a good job and do try to educate, but they're few and far between and don't seem to have any overall impact on the system as a whole. Now I'd like to talk about coping skills. I said the mental health professionals don't teach them. Let me talk about a few of the things they should be teaching. The first thing I like to talk about when I'm doing my education is the 3 things that are most likely to cause relapse. The first thing that is most likely to cause relapse is not taking medications as prescribed. And this is a no-brainer. It's just like the physical illness type 1 diabetes. If you don't take your medications, you're likely to get sick in short order. If we don't take our medication, we're likely to get sick in short order. Also, it's the insulin doesn't change the type 1 diabetes pancreas. It doesn't fix it. It's a lifelong condition. For almost all of us, our mental illness or psychotic illness is a lifelong condition. Just like the type 1 diabetes is a lifelong condition. Our antipsychotics do not fix the brain. It just allows us to function while we take them, just like the type 1 diabetic's insulin allows him to function while he takes it. That's the first thing that causes an awful lot of relapses, not taking medications as prescribed, and again, it's no brainer. The second thing that causes an awful lot of relapses is also no brainer. It's using alcohol, street drugs, or marijuana. Again, the alcohol, street drugs, and marijuana change the chemistry in our brain. It's important to remember that mental illnesses are both physical and chemical changes in our brain. When we take substances, they start changing the chemistry. It's very likely to interfere with our medications, very likely to cause us to relapse. And again, it's a no-brainer. Alcohol, street drugs, marijuana, very likely to cause a relapse. The third thing that is most likely to cause a relapse is stress. Stress can be many things to many people, and everyone has a different idea of what stress is to them and how to relieve it. We tend to think about bad things like getting fired as being very stressful, and it usually is. But good things like getting married can be just as stressful as getting fired. And again, any stress can cause you problems because it changes the chemistry of your brain, and that can result in needing more medication to cope. It can cause you relapse outright. And stress is a very big problem. And I think a lot of people taking meds as prescribed, stay away from alcohol, steroids, or marijuana, and get tripped up by stress, which is the third of the big three things that causes relapses. Now, because there's no way to live a stress-free life, we have to find ways to deal with our stress. And some of the things you do deal with stress, I think the number one thing to do is get on a good sleep-wake schedule. Get up at the same time every morning, go to bed at the same time every night, stay on a good schedule. A good night's sleep is important for everyone, whether they have mental illness or not, but it's especially important when you deal with a psychotic illness. Another thing you can do is get on a good daily routine. Having a good daily routine reduces the stress in your life. If you're doing the same kinds of things every day in the same manner, everything's a little different each day, but as long as you have a good daily routine, that lowers the stress level in your life. Something else you can do, some things that reduce stress: exercise, meditation, journaling, listen to music, hobbies and crafts, being helpful to others, performing meaningful work activities. There's many things you can do to reduce stress in your life. And something else I think everyone needs for reducing stress is to have a purpose in their life. Some goal, something they're working forward to, something they're trying to prove themselves to the world around them, some goal you work towards. I think that's very important for relieving stress and just having good mental health overall. So again, stress is the third thing that's most likely to cause relapse. And there's ways to deal with that, but there's no way to live a stress-free life. You're going to have to learn to live with some stress. There are many other things that can cause relapses, but those are the big three. If you think back over relapses you've had or seen in others, one of those three factors was probably a problem in most of them, because those are the most common causes of relapses. Another important thing is learning when to ask for help. Now, the first thing I always tell people when it comes to asking for help is to watch your sleep patterns. Anyone could have one sleepless night, but if you have 2 or 3 in a row, it's probably a problem. Time to talk to your doctor. If you're sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night or not at all, you're probably becoming manic. Again, time to talk to your doctor. Another thing to look at is if you're sleeping excessively. If you're sleeping all day, you may be depressed. Again, time to talk to your doctor. What you're doing is you're looking for things that are different from your normal pattern. When you start seeing changes in your sleep habits, changing your sleep patterns, that's when to start looking for other things. And it may be time to talk to your doctor because you may be on your way downhill for a relapse. Now, an interesting story about this, about 10 years ago, I was doing a hospital group. After I gave them the speech on sleep that I just gave you, a woman spoke up and said, "You know, I have bipolar disorder. I've been living with it for 10 years. During the month before this hospitalization, I had not slept for a month. And no one has ever told me before that not sleeping might be a good time to talk to your doctor." Now, this was a woman who had been 10 years in the system, 10 years with bipolar, and no mental health professional ever told her that not sleeping might be a warning sign of going downhill. That's another example of the failures of our mental health system to educate our patients on how to live with their illness. One of the most basic warning signs of going downhill with bipolar disorder is you stop sleeping or sleep only 2 or 3 hours a night. And this woman was totally unaware that was time to talk to someone else. Another thing you can do is look at symptoms that don't go away or symptoms that return that have gone away. If you have symptoms that have gone away and suddenly start returning, that's a warning sign to start asking for help. Another thing you look at is symptoms that are still there but start to get worse. For example, I still hear voices occasionally. If they become louder, hard to ignore, more of a problem, again, it's time to talk to my psychiatrist to get some help. And that's another important thing. Look for symptoms that either come back or get worse that you have all the time. Second, another big thing to look at. And the last thing I want to talk about here is your overall thinking. For most of us, after we've been psychotic once or twice, if we can remember what we went through, we can think back and say, you know, I'm starting to become a little strange in my thoughts. I'm starting to have strange thoughts, or I'm getting paranoid, or I'm getting grandiose. And you have a period for most of us of maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days, where you can question this and wonder whether that's all real. And if you look at this and say, you know, I may be heading downhill, and talk to your doctor and get help in the form of medication increase, you may be able to avoid a hospitalization entirely. That not everyone could do that. Some of us don't remember what we went through when we're psychotic, and it can be very hard to recognize when you're becoming psychotic again if you don't remember what you went through. But for those that can, it's good to try to learn to recognize when you're becoming delusional and seek help if you start to see yourself becoming delusional. And those are the 3 things that you can do yourself that are kind of key. But there's something else that's very important here as well. If you have a close friend or family member, someone who knows you well and sees you on a regular basis, they can sometimes would tell when you're going downhill before you can yourself. And that can be a very big help too. These friends and family members could often spot changes in mood or behavior before we do ourselves. Again, very good to have good friends and family members watch you and help monitor your condition. And if they see something going on, talk to you and listen to them and get help if you need it. Those are big things about learning when to ask for help. Another coping skill I talk about is something that everyone with psychosis needs to worry about. Like I said, for a lot of us, symptoms don't go away entirely. From the numbers vary depending on who you talk to, but it's common to say that as many as 50% of us still have some residual symptoms, even though we're properly medicated. In my case, I still hear voices occasionally, even though I'm properly medicated. Well, what I do is I divide the things I experience up into 3 big categories. The first category is those things I'm pretty sure are real, factual, actually happening, real world stuff. The second category is those things I'm pretty sure are not real, not actually happening, not real world stuff, hallucinations, delusions. And the third category I have is those things I'm just not sure about. And I put things into those 3 categories based on my own experience with my past experience with my illness. Now, I've learned that things are said directly to me face to face, I very seldom hallucinate that. So that's probably going to go in the bucket of real. If I hear it whispered down the corridor, down the hallway, those are things that often hallucinate. And then what I do is I look at what I've just heard and ask myself, does this make sense? Would the person really know that? Would they really say that? Does it make sense? If the answer is no, it does not make sense, it immediately goes to the bucket of hallucinations, delusions, and just forget about it. Otherwise, it often goes in the bucket of those things I'm just not sure about. And I'll leave it in that third bucket until I get some information that will allow me to put it in one of the other 2 buckets. Sometimes the information never does come. It kind of festers and frustrates. You want to know what's real, but I've learned that acting on things that are not real can get me in big trouble real quick. So I just leave things in that third bucket until sometime when I get information that will allow me to put it in one of the other 2 buckets. That's my method for coping with symptoms don't go away. I think everyone with psychosis needs some kind of method like that. You can use mine if you want to, but you need a method of some kind because it's very difficult to cope with the real world when you're not sure what the real world is. And you're going to make mistakes from time to time. I do too, but you have to try to learn from your mistakes and do better next time. But again, you need some kind of method to sort out what's real and what's not real so you can better cope with the real world. Next thing I want to talk about is forced treatment. There's a very big problem with forced treatment because a lot of people don't think we should ever force people into treatment for any reason. I totally disagree. I believe that anyone who is actively psychotic should be confined until such time as they are no longer psychotic. And let me explain why. First off, our definition of forced treatment says you have to be a danger to yourself or others before you can be submitted to forced treatment. And it can be very hard to determine you're a danger to yourself or others. And I think everyone with psychosis is a potential danger to yourself or others. In my case, I have a military background. I'm very familiar with small arms, very good at shooting, marksmanship. I've got experience with explosives. I've been trained in hand-to-hand combat. I think I could be a very big threat if I became psychotic and delusional. Now, I want to tell you a story about someone else here that I think illustrates the point even better. About 20 years ago, there was a man in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, that jumped off the top of the Ohio State University parking garage and fell to his death. The man had schizophrenia. The death was ruled a suicide. His family disagreed. His family said that prior to his death, he had been delusional and psychotic, and he was obviously preoccupied with religious delusions. And shortly before he jumped off that building, he'd been talking about the temptation of Christ from the Bible. And if you know anything about temptation of Christ, there's one part of it where the devil takes Christ up to a high place, tells him to jump off, that the angels will lift up and carry him away. The family believes that the young man had gone to the top of the garage and was jumping off so that the angels would lift up and carry him away. And that's their version of what they think happened. Now, we'll never know, of course, because we don't know what was actually going through the man's mind at the time, but that's certainly very possible. It's very realistic. I think it's very probable. And this is a perfect example of how a delusion can turn violent or dangerous in very short time. This man was known to be psychotic. He was known to be delusional, but he was not a danger to himself or others. In a period of a very short time, he conceived the notion of jumping off the top of the parking garage to his death. And that was probably not intentional. He probably didn't want to commit suicide, like his family says. They say he was not depressed. He was never suicidal before. He probably made that decision on the spur of the moment, probably no more than 2 or 3 minutes before he jumped. A casual observer would have had 2 or 3 minutes or less to figure out what he was doing, what he was about to do, and try to intervene, if the casual observer could have even intervened in time. Now, again, we don't know what the true story is for this man, but that's very likely. This is a perfect example of how someone with psychosis can become a danger to himself or others on very short notice when he does appear to be for quite some time before. Again, I think everyone with psychosis is potentially a danger to himself or others simply because they're psychotic. If you are a danger to yourself or others, of course, we can do something, but that's hard to prove. Something else I'm going to talk about here is 2 other occasions in society where we do allow people to be forcibly detained or have their rights taken away. One is for dementia. If you have an elderly person with dementia who decides to walk out of the house into a blizzard in house slippers and pajamas and nothing else, you're going to stop him. You clearly have a right to. You clearly want to help the person. It's clearly not right to let him walk out into the blizzard in pajamas and house slippers. Society accepts that. Another place where society accepts intervention is in the case of drunk driving. If you're at a party and a friend has had too much to drink, it's perfectly acceptable to take the keys away from him and not let him drive. Society accepts that. But we don't accept forced treatment for people with mental illness by all people. Something else I'd like to talk about with drunk driving for a moment. In the old days, before we had blood alcohol tests and breathalyzers, police officers used to do something called a field sobriety test. We have the person walk a straight line, touch their nose with the finger with their eyes closed, things like that, just subjective tests to try to determine if the person was physically impaired in any way. This is a very subjective test. The officer sometimes got it right, sometimes got it wrong, but that was all the officer had to go on, was that subjective test. When a psychiatrist is evaluating someone with psychosis today, he's essentially doing the same thing that police officer did with his field sobriety test. The psychiatrist has no test that he can use to determine the person is psychotic or to what degree, or whether that's danger to himself or others. All the psychiatrist can do is interview the person, observe the person, what he says, what he does, what he answers to questions, and try to make a decision as to whether or not the person is in danger to himself or others and needs to be hospitalized. Again, it's a subjective test. Psychiatrists can make mistakes. Sometimes they miss things, sometimes they don't, sometimes they overreact. but that's all we have to go on. It's just like the field sobriety test before the police officers had breathalyzers and blood alcohol tests. Now, the psychiatrist believes you need to be held. He will probably ask you to stay. If you don't want to stay, he has the option of giving you a 72-hour hold. What this means, you're placed in the hospital for up to 72 hours, so the hospital can observe you and get a better idea of whether or not you are, in fact, psychotic and endanger yourself or others. And if any time during the 72 hours the hospital believes you're not psychotic or not endanger yourself or others, they can release you. At the end of that 72 hours, a decision has to be made as to whether or not they think you are still psychotic and endanger yourself or others. If they do, they can ask you to stay, or if you don't want to stay, they can start commitment proceedings. Commitment proceedings means the doctor has to go before a judge and ask for permission to keep you in the hospital. The judge will have two psychiatrists present their opinion of you. You will be represented by a lawyer, and then you will be, the judge will make a decision as to whether or not you're going to stay in the hospital. At the end of that time, the judge will make a decision. If you decide you stay in the hospital, you go to the hospital, you stay there until the judge says you can get out. Another thing that goes along with this is frequently the person will not take medications on his own or at the request of the doctor. Either that happens, the doctor has to go back to the judge a second time and say, I want to forcibly medicate the person. The judge almost always grants that because unless they're forcibly medicated, there's no way to get over the psychosis and get released from the hospital. So it's almost always granted. But the doctor has to specifically go back to the judge a second time to get permission to forcibly medicate the person. And I think it's very unrealistic here to expect the people that are being forcibly medicated to continue taking medications once they're released from the hospital. You can often get people to take medication to the hospital, but once they're released, they're no longer under supervision. A lot of them will stop taking the medications, end up psychotic, and cycle back into the hospital. This is called the revolving door. They come in and out of the hospital all the time, or jails or prison. Another thing you need to know here too is a lot of people that don't take the medications end up in jails or prisons. In 2019,
it's 7:45, and I think you've covered some very vital areas of interest that our membership are delighted to have you address. I would like, if it's all right with you, if we could field some questions from our membership at this point. We have 15 minutes left.
Okay.
Very excellent job. Thank you so much. You can raise your hand by going into the react icon at the bottom of the toolbar, and Ann is going to read some questions from the chat.
Actually, Darrell, this is going till 8:15. Darrell still has time.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I'm going to let him continue.
I was almost done anyway. I just wanted to add, in 2019, the state of Ohio, you were 4 times more likely to be in a jail or prison than to be in a hospital if you had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, schizoaffective, or bipolar disorder. So you're 4 times more likely to be in jail or prison than a hospital if you have those diagnoses. That's a very sad condition. And most of those people that are in jails or prisons were not taking the medications and usually were often abusing drugs, alcohol, or marijuana when they committed whatever crime wound them up in prison. And again, most of these people should have been forcibly medicated in hospitals, whatever, but we aren't allowed to do that because you have a legal right to be homeless, psychotic, living under a bridge, you have a garbage can in the United States today. As long as you're not endangering yourself or others, as long as you're not breaking any laws, there's nothing we can do about letting you live under a bridge, psychotic, homeless, and you have a garbage can. With that, I was ready to open for questions.
Thank you, Darrell, for that very insightful presentation. And I just want to correct one thing. We're going to put all the questions in the chat just to, hopefully be able to get everybody's questions answered. That will make it go a little bit quicker. And I'm going to start. The first question is, I have a family member who has a mental illness. If that person has false memories, is there a way to correct that they truly believe in? The person lives with schizophrenia.
The false memories, there's nothing you do about that other than convince them they're false. And that can be very hard to do because, as I've said, we have lucid delusions. They're very real to you. Let me give you a story about this. Shortly after I published my book, I was doing a group in a hospital here in Columbus, And I had a woman come into the hospital group that I'd seen many times. She was what I call a frequent flyer. I seen her like 8 or 10 times in multiple hospitals, and she sat through my group and she just kept coming back. Well, as part of that group, I convinced her to stay and told her I had a new book and I was going to read it. This is one of the first times I used my book. We got the point on psychosis, and I mentioned the part about how psychosis is totally real and factually true to the person experiencing it. And she looked at that for a moment and said, is it actually real or does it seem real? Well, I had about 6 other persons spoke up at once saying it seems real. And she took that to thought, and you could tell from the rest of the group she was thinking about it. When I left the unit that night, I saw her talking to a nurse and asking the nurse if what she'd experienced could have been hallucination delusions. I believe that woman had never before been told what hallucination delusions were, how they interact with the person, how they could be giving you false senses of reality. And the fact that she now accepted that delusion and hallucination could give you a false sense of reality would allow her to question her own past experience. And I think that's the only way you can get through anosognosia, recognizing the false memories, is to realize it can happen and realize that you have to question things you've experienced. For those of us psychotic illness, it's very important for us to realize that we can never again be 100% sure what reality is. Until that realization sinks in, there's nothing you can do about false memories. To them, they're real, just like anything else they experienced.
Okay, next question is from Jeff. It said, you discussed anosognosia. How does one overcome that?
Same thing I just
Same
said.
thing. Yeah, okay. Let's see. This is from Ed. Can you please address the advisability of completing an advance directive in an inpatient and outpatient crisis plan in those you trust in the event of having a decompensating event? Do you recommend assertive community treatment for those coming out of a recurrent serious psychotic episode?
The advance directives are different for each state. Here in Ohio, I recommend everyone go through the advance directive process, a complete one, for the purpose of getting their thoughts on paper and sharing those thoughts with those around them, their treatment team, their family, whoever's important to you, so that you can get the treatment you want. Because if they don't know, you won't get what you want. But the advance directive itself is not worth the paper it's written on. Here in Ohio, you can break an advance directive at any time, right up until the point the judge says you're committed. That's the only time when you cannot break the advance directive. You could actually be in the hospital on a 72-hour hold and still tear up the advance directive and make it go away. So I don't think advance directives are worth much here in Ohio. Other states may have different rules, so I really can't address those rules. But here in Ohio, an advance directive is not worth the paper it's written on. But I think it's very important to go through the process so everyone knows what you want, so you can get the treatment you want. As far as assertive community treatment, stuff like that, for people that keep cycling out of the hospitals, I think it's very important to educate them. The kind of things I talked about here tonight, the kind of things I talked about in my book, I think are the keys to getting them to stop cycling out of hospitals. Like I said, most of our mental health professionals seem to think that medication is the only thing you need. No one educates them about the things in my book. I think that's the key to breaking the cycle. Obviously, we're not going to get through to everyone, but I think if we talked about these things with enough people, we would have a lot fewer people who are cycling in and out of hospitals and ending up in jails and prisons, because they would understand what their mental illness is, how to cope with it, how to live a normal life despite their mental illness. And I firmly believe that most of us with mental illness, even psychosis, can live a relatively normal life provided we do 3 things. Number 1, take your medications as prescribed. Number 2, stay away from alcohol, drugs, and marijuana. And number 3, cooperate with your treatment team. As long as you do those 3 things, you have an excellent chance of living a relatively normal life. There are no guarantees, but you have an excellent chance. If you don't do those 3 things, you may still live a normal life, but the odds approach 0.
Okay, next question. How do people with a mental illness know when it is real?
That's gaining insight. And I think the first step, like I said, is to educate them about what mental illness is. I've talked to lots of people with psychotic illnesses that don't understand what hallucination delusions are. I've talked to lots of patients in hospitals that don't know what their diagnosis means. The mental health system does not educate you about mental illness. They just tell you to take your meds and go on your way. And if you don't know what hallucinations, delusions are, you don't know what the symptoms of schizophrenia are, you don't know what symptoms of bipolar disorder are, you don't know what symptoms of schizophrenic disorder are, how are you going to know what you got when they don't even tell you what it is?
Okay, next question. How can we increase the number of beds in America for psychiatric care, that is? I don't know if you have any insight into that.
I don't have any insight into that, but I think if we educate the patients, we wouldn't need as many beds as we currently do.
Okay, from Stephanie, my question, is it possible that a person can become schizophrenic or schizoaffective after having smoked marijuana, even with no family history of the illness?
It's a very controversial topic, and the answer is there's a lot of evidence that point towards marijuana contributing to becoming psychotic. There's been studies for many years saying that's true. It's still controversial, but the best evidence we have for science says that it does increase the risk of developing psychotic illness if you use marijuana, particularly the younger you are and the more potent the marijuana is. It's the THC in the marijuana that causes this, and it appears to impact the development of the brain, cause the brain to develop wrong. And there's also a genetic link to this as well. Research has shown that there is one particular gene involved in this. It's a gene, I can't say the long name, the short name is the letters COMT. That's the name of the gene. This gene comes in two varieties. One variety is called MET, and one variety is called VAL. You get one of these genes from each parent, so you have two copies of the gene. If you have the VAL-VAL combination, you are the least likely to develop a psychotic illness if you use marijuana. If you have one MET and one VAL, you are 2.5 times more likely to develop a psychotic illness if you use marijuana than someone who has the VAL-VAL combination. But if you have the MET combination, you are 5 times more likely to develop a psychotic illness if you use marijuana than someone who has the VAL-VAL combination. And this research, I mentioned Dr. Robert Murray for the diagnosis thing. He's one of the researchers that determined that. The best research on marijuana is actually being conducted outside the United States. The best research I've seen on marijuana comes from Britain, Australia, and the Netherlands. There are other places to research it, but we don't do much here in the United States because of the way our health system works, the way our health records are maintained. They can do this in socialized medicine countries because the health records are available to researchers. Here in the United States, our records are not available, so they can't do the research here.
Okay, let's see, next question. How can a doctor tell between drug and/or alcohol psychosis and a mental illness?
The only way you can tell is to let the patient come off the drugs and alcohol and see what happens. There's a dispute about how long it takes for that to wash out of your system. Some people say 3 or 4 weeks, some people say a couple of months. But after the time period for it to wash out of your system is gone and you're still psychotic, you either had psychosis all along as a psychotic illness, or you do now as a result of taking the drugs or alcohol or whatever you had. But the key thing is to have time to let it wash out of the system, and whatever the doctor agrees is the appropriate time. If you're still psychotic after that point, it's the illness, not the drugs.
Okay, next question. I've read that 30% of the prison population is individuals with behavioral health challenges. What can we do about this to prevent them from going to prison initially?
I think the key thing is to change our treatment laws. Most people end up in prison for psychotic illnesses. Should have been enforced treatment before they got there. I think the fact that we allow people to run around the street psychotic and homeless is the key to stopping this. We stop doing that, they won't be up in prison. But I think also the education I'm talking about is key here too. I think if we educate the patients about their illness, how to live with it, how to cope with it, what they have to do, we have a lot fewer people ending up in jails and prisons, a lot fewer people ending up homeless on the streets, just a lot fewer people doing poorly as a result of having a serious mental illness. I can't tell you what the numbers would be because we have never done this before, but I think educating the patients about their mental illness, how to live and cope with it, is the answer to solving a lot of these problems. It won't make the problem go away, but it will make the problem a lot less prominent.
Okay, next question from Stephanie. Medication obviously works and is a help to those suffering with mental illness, but are there any natural treatments, foods, plants that can also be effective that no one has ever thought of?
The short answer is the only scientifically proven method to deal with psychosis is antipsychotic medications. There have been lots of advocates for other things. In fact, there's a whole branch of psychiatry known as orthomolecular psychiatry. This is a branch of psychiatry that was started in the late 50s by a Dr. Abram Hoffer from Canada. He teaches that niacin and vitamins in the right combination, the right strengths, can cure schizophrenia and treat it. Like I said, it started in the 50s. By the mid-70s, the American Psychiatric Association wrote a major position paper on this topic and said, please stop researching this. We've been researching foods and vitamins for many years, spending millions of dollars, and we have absolutely nothing to show for it, except that we give patients high doses of vitamin, they have funny colored urine. That's all we've been able to show for all these years of research. So please stop wasting this money. Yeah, the best answer I can give you for nutritional theories is that there may indeed be a small number of people with psychosis who do have nutritional problems, but they are a very small number, and we have no way to identify them and tell who they are. So we have no way to do studies, no way to do anything about it. Right now, our science is ignoring it because they have no way to identify them, no way to know anything about it. As far as we can tell, it doesn't exist, but we can't say for sure it doesn't exist. So although it may exist, it's a very small number. And again, we have no way to identify who or how to deal with it.
Okay, great. And next question from Roger. My brother originally was diagnosed with schizophrenia 45 years ago. He was on medication for 40 years. The last 4 to 5 years he was off. The diagnosis has changed to schizoaffective maybe 15 years ago. Now he was in the hospital for a long-term stay, 3 months now, and he's back on medication, though they are trying to figure out the best for him. First was risperidone and switched to Zyprexa, and he's making slow progress. How do we know which medication was working the best for you? I'm hoping the psychiatrist will get this right, and then he will hopefully recover to the level he was 5 years ago.
Two things. When you take a medication and go off it, frequently it doesn't ever work as well again. If you go off the medication, you're taking a serious chance that it may not work as well the second time around. Also, as I said earlier, we have no idea what's going to happen with any given medication until you take it. We have no way to know what the miracle medication is going to be for any given person until they find it. It's all trial and error. I wish I could say something different, but that's all we have today is trial and error. The only thing we have different than trial and error is there is one genetic test where they take a swab and collect some of your saliva for a DNA test. From that DNA test, they can tell what the 6 genes in your liver are that determine how medications are metabolized. With that test, they can tell how fast a medication will be metabolized by your liver. That gives some indications to what dose may be needed, but that's all we can do. That's the only thing we have. We don't have anything to tell you what's going to work. We don't have anything to tell you what's going to have side effects or what's not going to have side effects. The only thing we have is that one genetic test, which tells us how fast the liver is going to metabolize the med. That's the only thing we have today other than trial and error at all.
Okay, next question is from Laura. What do you think is the best way to educate judges about anosognosia?
I think we need to explain to everyone what psychosis is. That little speech I gave about what psychosis is, I think should be front page news for every judge, every educator, every politician, every policymaker in the country. Because most people, including unfortunately many mental health professionals, do not know that. We have a misperception today that if you're a mental health professional, you can deal with any mental health problem or any mental health issue, regardless of what it is. That is like saying that if you're a medical doctor, you can be a family care practitioner one day, a brain surgeon the next, a heart surgeon the day following that, do a liver transplant the day following that, and a knee transplant the day following that. It's ridiculous. But we think that mental health professionals could deal with any mental health problem. The actual fact is that many mental health professionals do not have the special skill sets needed to work with psychosis. It's a very sad fact, but I think most mental health professionals today do not know how to deal with psychosis. They just don't know about it.
Okay, and here's another question from Stephanie. This is a bit controversial. Do you think there is a spiritual element to mental illness, and how to balance a line of religious preoccupation and one seeking their faith?
It's a very good question and probably the most difficult question any psychiatrist ever has to deal with. The delusions are often religious in nature. For example, if someone thinks he's Jesus Christ or a woman thinks she's Mary or vice versa, that's very hard to deal with. But that's something that's obviously false. We know that's a delusion. But sometimes it's very hard to tell whether it's delusional hallucination or whether it's legitimate religion. I think that's the hardest decision any psychiatrist has to make, because we want you to be able to practice your religion and live the life the way you want to, but at the same time, we want to treat your illness and get it under control. And it can be very hard sometimes to determine what is the illness and what's the religion. What the doctor usually does is look at your background, where you come from, what the beliefs of the people around you are, to try to determine that. But there's just no good way. I think this is the toughest decision any psychiatrist ever has to make. Is it your religion or is it your illness?
Okay, thank you. And another question from Laura. Clozaril is a gold standard. What do you think?
The medications are all about the same. Doesn't matter whether it's first generation or second generation. The results are about the same for all of them. They just have different side effects. The sole exception is Clozaril. Clozaril is more likely to work than any other antipsychotic. That's true. Clozaril is more likely to fight suicidal ideations than any other antipsychotic. That's true. But Clozaril does not work for everyone. And it's not the answer to everything either. Basically, it doesn't matter what antipsychotic you want to try it, see whether or not it works, and go from there. But if you have failed on several antipsychotics, you probably should try Clozaril, because this is the one that's most likely to work. It's called the medication of last result. I think the current criteria are you have to try 2 different antipsychotics before you try Clozaril and not work. But a lot of people don't understand that's taking 2 antipsychotics like you're supposed to. A lot of people think that if someone takes an antipsychotic and goes off it and doesn't take it like they're supposed to, that counts as a failure. But that does not. It's taking 2 antipsychotics like you're supposed to, following the doctor's orders, and they don't work, then it may be time to try Clozaril. And I do think Clozaril is the best antipsychotic out there, but it's not the answer to everyone. And I think it should be a last resort. But again, you should probably try it if you tried several other antipsychotics and it hasn't worked. And again, there's no difference between first generation and second generation antipsychotics other than what the most common side effects are. They're all equally likely to work with the exception of Clozaril.
Okay, question from Ed. Have any of the new weight reduction medications been used with patients taking medications such as antipsychotics and mood stabilizers that cause increased weight gain? Any research to establish these medications as evidence-based in reducing the serious medication side effect? I don't know if you have any.
I really can't answer that question. You'd have to
Yeah,
ask the
I
doctor.
thought that was more of a medical question, but okay. Here's another one, so I'm not sure. This is kind of a medical question too, but I'll read it. Do you think 3-month shots of Invega are a safe medication, especially if the person is at risk with SMI doesn't accept their diagnosis?
I think injectables are a very good way to go. Every study that's ever been done comparing an injectable form of a medication to the pill form of the medication, the injectable has done better. Reason being, you never forget it, you're never off schedule, you always have the same dose of your bloodstream at the same time. If you're taking pills, there's always a chance you may forget it or get off schedule, or change the amount in your bloodstream. And if you take pills, the amount in the bloodstream often goes up and down depending on when you take the pills. So the injections always work better. Now, for another thing, for the injections, you should always try the pill form of the medication first to make sure you have no serious side effects from the medication before you try the injection. Reason being, if it's the pill and you have serious side effects, you can stop it immediately. If you take the injection without checking for serious side effects first, and you do have serious side effects, the medication is there for a month or 3 months or whatever the injection is for, and you can't stop it. So you should always try the pill first. And I do believe that injectables are the way to go. If your antipsychotic is available and injectable, you should probably use it. My wife uses an injectable antipsychotic and does very well on it. It's been a miracle for her. I think injectables are definitely the way to go if you've got one that works for you.
Okay, another question from Laura. What if the anosognosia is so bad that there is no leverage or rock bottom to get them to medicate voluntarily?
The reason is they don't realize it's not real, in my opinion. Anosognosia, like I said, to them, it's all real. No one's ever explained to them what hallucinations, delusions are. So to them, because they experienced it, it was real. They can't realize it was false, never happened. And I think that's the key problem with anosognosia. There's no way to fight that other than convince them that they could have experienced something that was not real, and then get them to question what they've experienced. I know of no other way to fight anosognosia. And for them, it will probably always seem real, but you may be able to get them to question whether or not it was real, in some cases accept that it couldn't possibly have been real. I think that's the only way to deal with anosognosia.
Okay, thank you. And there's, let's see, from Justin, can brain trauma cause a mental illness?
Brain trauma can cause a lot of things, but from what I've read, brain trauma, the only mental illness I'm aware of that's caused directly by brain trauma is the one professional football players get where they have repeated concussions. It's called, can't think of the name right now, it's slipping my mind, but they get a form of depression that's caused by repeated concussions and damages to the brain. That definitely causes a mental illness. That's the other one I know of where there's a direct link between damage to the brain and causing mental illness. But traumatic brain injuries and other things can definitely cause symptoms like a mental illness. It can definitely impact someone who does have a mental illness. But I don't know of any other mental illness other than the one that professional football players have that's directly caused by brain injury.
Okay, thank you, Doug. That's CTE, I think you were talking about, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions. If anybody has any questions, you can put the last minute ones in the chat. Otherwise, Darrell, thank you again. It was a great presentation, very informative. Okay. Angeline, can you put your question in the chat, please? I see somebody has a hand raised. It's just easier to do that than. Let me see if I can figure out. Try to.
Darrell, and can I ask my follow-up to Darrell? That was my question about the rock bottom. And you had said, well, you have to explain that their delusions weren't real and hallucinations. But my son doesn't recall what happened. And even seeing photos and evidence still doesn't recognize that it was anything other than a mental breakdown. When we know.
You need to understand that for someone with psychosis, some of us remember everything that happened to us when we're psychotic, just like everyone else does. Some of us remember nothing. Some of us remember only a little. I've never seen any research to determine what the difference is and why some people remember everything, some don't. But the only thing I've observed is for people to remember everything, it's much easier to recognize when you're going downhill and to recognize you have problems than for those that can't remember anything that happened when they were psychotic. And I don't know anything that's ever been done about that. I don't know any research that's ever been done on it. It's just something I've observed over the years that some people remember everything, some people remember nothing, and some people remember only some. And I think the people that remember everything are the most likely to do well, but I know nothing else about this. It's something that I think psychiatrists should study.
Okay, I don't think Angeline's seeing my chat, so I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to ask her to unmute. That's working.
I asked her to unmute, Anne.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I had sent it to Darrell, my question. It's two things. In California, we need a durable power of attorney and a healthcare directive and a will to speak for people that have psychotic issues. Because I dealt with this personally with a family member for 15 years. Just an FYI. And then here in Medi-Cal, they don't want to deal with it. And another one that was on medication increases. They'll send you to a new doctor. They'll refuse to increase their medications, even though that medicine would work for 30 some years. I personally fought this for 7 months and he died. I filed with Medi-Cal, Trevanta, you name it, even Kaiser. They could care less. But back to Mr. Darrell, yes, Clozaril worked. My brother was on that and it worked very well. But when they put him, that one new doctor, she said, oh no, it's too much medication, take it off. It set him back, and I'm not kidding, 30 years in his life. He was never the same because they refused to keep him on the medication because they want to go cheaper and less medications. Just an FYI, and I thank Mr. Herrmann for what he's doing, and we need more people like him to speak up. Thank you.
Something else I think I should talk about what you just said. There's a practice called polypharmacy, where a doctor will prescribe more than one antipsychotic at the same time. This is very controversial in the psychiatric community because no one has ever done studies on using 2, 3, 4, how many antipsychotics at the same time. Some doctors believe this is a mistake. You should never have more than one antipsychotic at the same time. Other doctors don't see a problem with it, will prescribe 5 or 6. In general, what you're seeing, though, is that the more antipsychotics you have, the more likely you are to have bad side effects. And it's hard to tell what any given antipsychotic is doing for you when you have more than one at once. I think the best policy is to be on as few antipsychotics at the lowest dose possible to control the illness. But there are doctors that don't do that. And I've also seen people that definitely do better on 2 antipsychotics than either one alone. So polypharmacy does sometimes work, but it is a controversial thing in the psychiatric community. Some doctors will never do it. Some doctors don't have a problem, will give you 5 or 6. It's something the doctors do.
Yeah, I think we have time maybe for one more question before we reach our time limit. Anyone else want to raise their hand and ask a question? Or
Well, Laura has a question here in the chat. What about AOT as a solution? I think that you had spoke a little bit about that.
Well, I think AOT is a very good program. I think it's very good for people that need help and won't get it. I think teaching the things that I'm talking about, teaching them, will have a lot fewer people in AOT situations. But what if they're in that situation? I think AOT is a good answer. Yes.
And Angeline, let's see how do we ask her to mute. Oh.
Hello.
Hi, you're all set, Angeline, to ask a question.
Thank you. I don't, in California, it's very tough on people with mental illnesses because we don't have enough beds for them. And then when we have people, you get them back on the medications and they need med management, we can't get enough funding for what we call board and care homes. That's where someone can oversee them, usually 6 to 10 beds, and it's a home, but there is med management, and that's what we need instead of having someone just like they're doing right now is portable doctors to the homeless, give them a shot, give them a pill. Well, when they go back in 3 months, they're not there. But a board and care home is very important because they need the med management, they need the oversight, because we can't just dump them in an apartment or a hotel room and expect them to self-manage because they can't, or self-medicate. And then we also need to have Medi-Cal rethink their thinking because they only allow you so many treatments of outpatient for counseling or psychiatric care. And that's going to be a big downfall. And then back to this marijuana, that does create psychosis. And we're going to see more of this in the next 10 years, unfortunately, because people are self-medicating. And what's going to happen when that no longer works? Because our health plans don't want to cover psychiatric treatment or outpatient. Thank you.
Let me talk about the marijuana for a moment. This is something I didn't talk about earlier, but marijuana is very bad for people with psychotic illness. And the reason is very simple. When you take THC, it affects the dopamine in the brain, but so does every antipsychotic we have today. Every antipsychotic we have today dampens down dopamine activity in the brain, makes there's less dopamine available to the brain, and that's how they control your hallucinations, delusions. But when you use marijuana, the THC in the marijuana actually increases the level of dopamine in the brain, so it's working exactly the opposite direction of the antipsychotic medications. And that's why it's so important for people with psychotic illness to stay away from marijuana, because it does work in exactly the opposite direction of medications. And there are some forms of marijuana that treat today that are so potent, contain so much THC, that they can cause psychosis all by themselves in people that don't even have a psychotic illness, let alone those that do. And I think we're faced a very big problem by trying to legalize marijuana because it's going to make things worse for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think on that note, Darrell, thank you for a very thorough, comprehensive overview for both our peers and our professionals. I mean, you are very knowledgeable in many areas. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. And I hope we can have you back again at a future peer talk, because I think we're going to want to have you to reprise your your talk for our new members that come on board. And I anticipate we're going to have many of those because of people like you who are willing to collaborate with the doctors and other adult peers and concerned family members, especially. They're represented in our membership. So thanks again, and we'd like to have you back in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darrell. And again, I put in the chat, anybody that's interested in purchasing Darrell's book, Straight Talk About Living with a Severe Mental Illness by Darrell Herrmann, can be purchased on Amazon.
It's available in Kindle, audiobook, and paperback.
Great.
Thank you, Darrell.
Yes, thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone, for
And,
participating.
okay. Good night,
All right,
everybody.
good night, everyone.